What makes a person more likely to be sexist? What types of traits or beliefs or demographics should you look out for if you want to avoid sexist people? I'm Anna, I'm a psychologist in training. On this channel we talk about real-life applications to psychology, and today we're talking about this: what makes a person more likely to be sexist? Before we go into that, we kind of have to distinguish between hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. Both fall under what's called the ambivalent sexism theory, which states that hostile sexism is basically the stereotypical idea that we have of sexism, that women are inferior to men, that women aren't as good as men in a bunch of different characteristics, that men should be the one in power because of that. Versus benevolent sexism says that yes, men should be the ones in power, but only because women are just a little more frail and gentle, and men are the protectors, the strong ones, and they're supposed to maintain the status quo while protecting their inferiors. I think of hostile sexism as like masculinity channels and benevolent sexism as femininity channels. They kind of play into both of those roles, where like a lot of masculinity channels will say men are the best, men are the greatest, alphas, women suck, all that stuff. And femininity channels will say, well, both men and women are great in different ways. It's kind of like separate but equal, but the men should be in power because of the characteristics that they intrinsically have. So I looked at all the research I could find on this, and here are the characteristics that are the strongest predictors of sexism. In terms of demographics, male, older, and lower education level tend to be associated with greater amounts of sexism. It's not surprising that men are far more likely to be sexist than women because of the way that sexism is built into our society. Men obviously have a lot more to gain from sexism than women do. Also, interestingly, a stronger masculine or feminine identification has also been associated with higher amounts of sexism. I've said this before, but people who identify very strongly with either masculinity or femininity tend to aim very hard to try to preserve that characteristic and often fall into the trap of what I call fragile gender roles. I have a whole video on fragile masculinity and fragile femininity if you'd like to check that out up here. Age is another correlate, so older people do tend to have a more old school worldview that women fall under men in the gender hierarchy. Although I will say a lot of young people these days have no issue matching older people in sexism. I think that's why they're called Zoomers. And also, not surprising, lower education level. This also makes a lot of sense because most people learn through education to release unfounded biases, to interact with people from different backgrounds, to humanize them, and so uneducated people do tend to be more bigoted in that sense. Personality-wise, narcissism, entitlement, aggressiveness, low empathy, and low perspective taking have all been associated with sexist beliefs. So perspective taking is the ability to adopt the psychological viewpoint of another person, while empathic concern is the tendency to sympathize with especially unfortunate others. So low empathic concern has been found to predict hostile sexism, and low perspective taking and empathic concern predict benevolent sexism. This certainly makes a lot of sense. Someone who struggles to view other people's perspectives and who doesn't care much about the suffering of others is likely to be sexist and probably bigoted in a lot of other ways as well. And entitlement is also specifically linked to sexism and to hostility and aggression. One study hypothesized that entitlement would predict hostile sexism in men because entitlement in men, in part, is this capitalization on the hostile sexist belief that men deserve more power than women, and benevolent sexism in women, because entitled women in part capitalize on the benevolent sexist belief that women are deserving of special favors because they're weaker and need to be taken care of. Both of the hypotheses were confirmed. Entitlement predicted benevolent sexism in women but not men, and hostile sexism in men but not women. Need for closure has also been associated with sexism. This is sort of a cognitive pattern where you need to receive a firm answer to a question and also have an aversion to ambiguity. So people with a high need for closure tend to pass quick judgments and rely on pre-existing schemas to conclude their judgments. Research has found a strong relationship between the need for closure and stereotypical gender attitudes. Acceptance of violence, a history of intimate partner violence, and psychological aggression have also been correlated with sexism. Studies have found that male sexist participants are more prone to justifying white beating and believe that battered women deserve to be battered. They also tend to have a history of violence against women themselves and to score higher on items of psychological aggression. Religion and ideology have also been associated with sexism. This one is complicated, so just bear with me for a second. Past research has found that there's a link between religiosity and sexism in all three Abrahamic religions, which are Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. For example, one large study from Spain found that Catholic religiosity predicts benevolent but not hostile sexist attitudes. However, more recent research suggests that it's not so much religion itself that predicts sexism, but rather a specific socio-political ideology that is often found in very religious people, as well as less religious people. This ideology is characterized by authoritarianism, which certainly makes sense. People who believe politicians have a right to tell everyone what to do are likely to also believe that men have a right to tell women what to do. One study on a Chinese population found that Chinese traditionality was a predictor for sexism. It's interesting that having a very traditional belief set can make you more likely to be sexist, but the study also found that having modern beliefs does not mean that you are automatically less sexist. This certainly makes a lot of sense. I've known many people who are not traditional, who are modern, and yet still are sexist. So the traditional Chinese values that they looked at were basically these social norms and structures that promote Chinese patriarchy, where there's an emphasis on hierarchy and leadership and the unquestioning submission of subordinates, collectivism, authoritarianism, and the subservience of women. There is this one really interesting study that parsed out exactly how much of sexism was predicted by religion versus ideology, and here's what they found. Although individual differences in religiosity did predict traditional gender role beliefs and sexism towards both men and women, it was not so much a predictor as individual differences in social ideological attitudes, particularly social dominance orientation and authoritarianism. This is because sexism primarily relates to individual differences in people's perspectives on the social world, and religiosity explains little additional variance on top of that. So I'm just going to read straight from what the authors of this research said. High levels of right-wing authoritarianism reflect cultural conservatism and traditionalism based on a profound desire for social cohesion and collective security. High levels of social dominance orientation are an expression of economic hierarchical conservatism based on the motivational goal for group-based power, dominance, and superiority. Together, right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation cast a wide-ranging net that predicts variation in most domains of prejudice, discrimination, and related intergroup attitudes. In other words, at first glance, a higher level of religiosity is associated with higher sexism. However, when social attitudes are taken into account, the contribution of religiosity drops significantly. To put things simply, it's not religion itself that makes a person sexist, it's the ideologies that many people unfortunately try to justify through religion. There's plenty of sexism in atheist circles too. If a person wants to be sexist, they don't need to be in a religious community to do so. They can find plenty of sexist subcultures elsewhere. And it does seem that a person's social ideological attitudes appear to matter above and beyond one's own gender group or the depth of one's religious commitment. So in conclusion, the prototype of someone who is most likely to be sexist is an older, less educated, narcissistic male with rigid cognitive structures, an acceptance and propensity towards aggression, especially towards women, and authoritarian or dominant ideology that may or may not be justified through religion. That doesn't mean that someone who has all these characteristics or many of these characteristics is guaranteed to be sexist. Obviously, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't prejudge people. That's, the same concept as sexism itself. But these are the most important predictors of sexism that I could find in the literature at this time. As always, references can be found in the description box. Does this match up with your experience? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this topic, so put those down below and I'll try to get to reading them. I will see you in a few days and hope you have a great rest of your week.